Overia sometimes dreamed of a life where being an Omega was not a sentence. In the dream, there was warmth, a simple house, a set table, someone saying her name without contempt. But the dream never lasted. The fortress always pulled her back into reality with its well-dressed cruelty. That morning, she was accused in front of everyone of a mistake she had not made, ruining the preparation of the herbs meant for the king's sacred wolf, which could leave her weak, nauseous, and unable to endure the pregnancy as she should. There was no defense. No one listened. Only the weight of the stares, the restrained laughter, and the old certainty that an Omega could be discarded without cost. Mina smiled as they shoved her out of the hall, and Overia felt shame burn deep inside her, more painful than the cold. The barn was her destination. Alone, without food and without a proper blanket, she trembled until her body lost its strength. The straw was damp, the air cut through her skin, and abandonment seemed to have a smell. Overia cried in silence at first, then without being able to hold it back anymore, until she finally fell asleep exhausted, her face wet and her heart wounded. That was when Cyra appeared. The King Alpha's sacred wolf, pregnant and far too important to be there, appeared at the entrance to the barn with a strange urgency in her eyes. She did not seem to have come by chance. There was something in the air, as if an invisible call had drawn her to that forgotten place. Cyra swayed, weak, before she could even cross the doorway. Overia woke with a start, still half dazed, and only then saw the wolf in front of her. When she caught her before she could fall, she felt the weight of that meeting before she could even understand it. And at the moment she heard footsteps approaching outside, she had the feeling that she had just gotten tangled in a situation from which she might not come out whole. And then the door opened again. Kalethor, the most feared Alpha King of the North, appeared in the dark doorway, looking at the pregnant wolf and at the rejected Omega covered in cold and humiliation. The silence that fell there tasted like destiny, and something in his expression made it clear that the night was still far from over. If you love intense wolf stories with destiny and twists, go ahead and subscribe to the channel right now. So subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any chapters. And how about we get to know each other better? I'm Maggie Reed, the author of these stories, and you. Drop a comment below with your name and what city you're watching from. If I freeze tonight, someone write a very apologetic memo. Overia muttered that to herself as she pulled the old blanket up to her chin and tried to ignore the wind slipping through the cracks in the barn, like it had a personal grievance against her. The straw beneath her body was not soft, not dry, and certainly not dignified enough to be called a bed. It was a rough, damp heap that smelled like mildew, old wood, and the kind of neglect the fortress reserved for whatever it no longer wanted to see by morning. And tonight, that included her. The punishment had been fast, public, and cruel enough to sting for hours. In the main hall, in front of servants, guards, and 2 advisors who never missed an important humiliation, Mina had accused her of ruining a batch of herbs prepared for the king's sacred wolf. It was a lie. Overia knew it. She had sorted the leaves carefully, checked every vial, every root, every drop of infusion. But in the fortress, truth was not something you defended. It was something you bent until it fit the will of whoever held power. "You think you can touch the wolf's chambers like you're someone?" Mina had said, loud enough for every ear in the room to hear. Overia still felt the weight of that question burning inside her. It wasn't just the tone. It was the smile that followed. The quiet satisfaction of someone who knew exactly where to press to hurt. "I only prepared the medicine," Overia had replied, keeping her voice steady with effort. "You prepared it wrong." And then came the laughter. Not loud, worse than loud. The small kind, the kind that didn't need an audience to do damage. A guard leaning against a column, a servant with her head lowered too quickly, one of the kitchen women covering her mouth as if she were shocked instead of entertained. Overia knew that kind of cruelty. It didn't need volume to be public. Mina lifted the vial and held it up like proof of a crime she had invented. The Omega is careless, disobedient, and now she's going to learn that even the floor serves better than she does. The silence that followed was heavy, because no one argued. No one ever argued when it was Overia. That was how the sentence came down, simple and efficient. The barn. Alone. No supper. Overia had felt her face burn, not from tears, but from shame. That deep, ancient shame that did not come from what she had done, but from existing in the exact place where others decided she was inconvenient. She was shoved out of the hall too quickly, as if the air needed to be cleaned after touching her. And now she was here, alone. The wind crawled in through the poorly sealed roof, curling over the straw in thin, icy threads. Somewhere far away, the fortress vibrated with music, footsteps, cutlery, voices, and the comfort of people who had never needed to sleep on a cold floor just to remember their place. Overia wrapped her arms around her knees. "You're being dramatic," she whispered to herself. "It's not the end of the world, just the end of my dignity." And honestly, that thing was overdue for maintenance. The joke almost worked. Almost. Because the barn was only part of the humiliation. The real wound was the contrast. The warm windows of the fortress glowed in the distance, as if they belonged to another life. Somewhere inside, the king's sacred wolf was resting in comfort, surrounded by thick blankets, heated braziers, and attendants moving quietly around her. Cyra had protection, warmth, space, and respect, and she deserved all of it. Cyra was not the king's wife, not his queen, not a romantic partner hidden away in some forbidden corner of the court. She was something older, rarer, and far more revered. A sacred wolf of the line of old blood. Only a few such wolves still existed in the world, and Cyra was one of them. A speaking, thinking, conscious creature bound to the royal house by an ancient covenant of loyalty and protection. Her kind was not treated as property. They were honored as living treasures, beings whose lives shaped the fate of entire dynasties. Kalethor protected her because that was his duty, but also because the bond between them had been built over years of trust, care, and mutual loyalty. Not romance. Something deeper and more sacred than that. Overia closed her eyes for a moment, too tired even to envy her properly. And at that exact same moment, far away in the fortress, Cyra woke with a strange feeling. Not pain, not hunger, not even a clear memory. It was something harder to name, as if her body had heard a call her mind had not yet recognized. The wolf opened her eyes in the lamplit room and lay still for several seconds, sensing an unfamiliar pressure in her chest. Her belly was heavy with pregnancy, the movement of life inside her constant and familiar. But this feeling was different. A soft tug, almost imperceptible, coming from very far away. She sat up slowly. The servant sleeping nearby opened one eye, half asleep. "My lady?" Cyra didn't answer right away. She turned her face toward the door, as if listening to something beyond the walls. The hallway was silent, but not empty silent. There was an absence there that felt charged, a lack that made her uneasy. She placed a hand over her chest. The sensation grew. It wasn't alarm. It was impulse. The need to go somewhere before she even knew why. Cyra climbed out of bed carefully. Her pregnant body demanded attention with every step, but the strange call pushed her forward with stubborn insistence. "I'm going out for a moment," she murmured. The servant sat up at once. "Shall I call the guards?" "No, I just need to walk." And for some reason, that felt true enough for the woman not to insist. Cyra crossed the noble wing slowly but with purpose, her heavy belly shifting as she moved. The castle was warm, polished, safe. Everything in it seemed designed to protect what was precious, and that was exactly why the pull felt so strange. Something in her kept dragging in the opposite direction, deeper, farther, toward the forgotten side of the fortress, toward the cold. She felt the first wave of nausea near the stairway leading to the storage rooms. She stopped, closed her eyes, and breathed deeply, hoping it would pass. The scent of damp stone and stored wood did not help. Her body seemed to want to fold in on itself for a moment, as if the walk had awakened a weakness she had been ignoring. Still, she kept going. Not out of stubbornness, or maybe out of stubbornness. But there was a quiet certainty driving her forward. In the outer courtyard, the wind hit her harder. Cyra hunched her shoulders, tried to keep moving, and then felt a sudden wave of dizziness. Her vision darkened around the edges for a second. She stopped, put a hand against the stone wall, and breathed once, twice, 3 times. Inside her, something shifted uneasily. Not violently, just intensely. She let out the breath slowly. "Easy," she whispered, not knowing whether she was speaking to her own body or to whatever had called her here. The side path leading to the barns was narrow and poorly lit. No one crossed it at that hour except late servants and carriers. Under normal circumstances, Cyra would never have set foot on that path. But tonight was not normal. When she finally saw the barn, a wave of exhaustion hit her so hard she nearly stopped. The smell of straw, dampness, and old wood drifted from the building like a memory, and for one absurd moment she had the impression that the place had been waiting for her. She took 2 more steps, then 1 more, and then the weakness took her in earnest. Her legs buckled. Cyra tried to steady herself, but her body had become heavier than it should have been, her chest tight from the effort of walking. The world tipped at the edges. That was when the side door of the barn opened from the inside. Overia appeared in the doorway with an empty bowl in her hands, her hair half loose, her old blanket slipping from one shoulder, her face pale from cold and irritation. She was about to say something, maybe a comment about the weather, maybe a curse on the night itself, when she saw the golden figure standing before her. "Are you lost?" she asked before she even realized who it was. Cyra tried to answer, but another wave of nausea forced her to bring a hand to her mouth. Overia dropped the bowl into the straw at once. "No, wait, you're not well." The wolf tried to inhale deeply, but the air seemed to scrape her throat. Her body gave way in a slow, involuntary motion, and she would have fallen if Overia had not stepped forward and caught her by the shoulders. The touch was immediate, warm, steady, completely different from the cold of the rest of the world. Cyra leaned against her without arguing, the weight of pregnancy and illness suddenly settling into her trembling knees. Overia braced herself and, for one startled moment, realized she was actually holding one of the kingdom's most sacred and protected beings upright on the threshold between cold and darkness. Not a pet, not a servant's animal, a valued, rare royal wolf whose life mattered to the entire realm. "You're dizzy," Overia said, more to confirm than to ask. Cyra opened her eyes slowly. Her golden gaze met hers. There was a second of silence so complete it seemed to shift the air inside the barn. Overia felt a shiver run up the arm she had around the wolf. It wasn't fear. It wasn't reverence. It was something less rational, more physical. A strange sensation of being part of a scene already written by some ancient force. Cyra tried to speak, but her voice failed. Overia pressed her lips together. "It's fine. You don't need to talk. Just don't collapse by yourself, because I've already had a bad enough night without adding a real scandal to the list." Cyra tried to smile, but the effort made her close her eyes again. "I didn't mean to..." "Good. Because I didn't plan this either, and my emotional schedule is fully booked." Even weak, Cyra let out a small breath that was almost a laugh. Overia felt her own mouth respond, something between surprise and relief. She helped the wolf into the barn, guiding her around the doorframe and toward the dry straw in the corner. Inside, it was even colder than before. Overia pulled the old blanket free, arranged it beneath Cyra, and went to fetch a water jug leaning against the wall. When she returned, the wolf was breathing carefully, her face paler than before. "Is this getting worse?" Overia asked, trying to keep her voice low and practical. Cyra closed her eyes for a moment and gave the slightest nod. "I don't know." Overia frowned. That was not the answer she wanted, but it was enough to understand that whatever was happening needed attention fast. She held the jug with both hands, as if that might help organize her thoughts, and studied the wolf's posture, the way one hand stayed pressed against her belly, the tension in her jaw. Not labor, not imminent labor, but not trivial either. It was weakness, overexertion, a pregnant body too tired for the walk she had taken. "You walked here alone?" Overia asked, incredulous. Cyra opened her eyes with effort. "I felt." Overia blinked. "Felt what?" Cyra took a moment, as if trying to translate something she did not fully understand herself. "A call. It made no sense. But I had to come." Overia went quiet. In any other night, that answer would have seemed absurd. But here, with the cold biting at her fingers and the sacred wolf trembling with exhaustion beside her, there was something too serious in the air to dismiss as coincidence. She placed a hand on Cyra's forehead. Warm. Not fever. Not yet. But too warm for someone who had left a heated room and walked this far in the cold. "You're cold on the outside and hot on the inside," Overia muttered, thinking aloud. "That's a terrible combination, and I say that with the clinical experience of someone who had a bad childhood." Cyra made a short sound, almost a tired laugh. Overia moved to the barn door and pushed the wooden latch with her shoulder. She needed more blankets, maybe medicine, maybe help. She needed to tell someone. But before she could take 2 steps outside, she heard the sound of boots pounding through the outer corridor. Several. Overia turned just in time to see Kalethor step into view like a storm forced into human shape. The king was without his usual ceremonial calm. His gaze swept the room in a second, finding the blanket on the floor first, then the pale wolf on the straw, and finally, Overia standing before her. It was like watching someone realize they had lost something sacred and important, and might already be too late. "Cyra," he said, and his voice was lower than usual, dangerous in an intimate way. Overia felt her stomach tighten. Kalethor crossed the room quickly, kneeling beside her before asking anything else. His hand found Cyra's face with such care it was almost frightening. "Where were you?" he asked, and there was no anger in the tone. There was contained panic. Cyra breathed deeply, still weak, and tried to answer. "I felt something." Kalethor lifted his eyes to Overia, and then it was her turn to feel the full weight of his gaze. "What happened here?" Overia opened her mouth to explain, but the words seemed to catch for a second behind her teeth. Not because she didn't know what to say, but because she was seeing, for the first time, the king without the full shield of control he usually wore. He was not there as authority. He was there as someone afraid. That somehow changed everything. Overia pointed carefully toward Cyra. "She came walking, alone. She was weak when she arrived. I only kept her from falling on the way in." Kalethor went still for 1 second, his jaw tightening slowly. Then he looked back at Cyra, his face hardening with relief and shock all at once. "You left the chambers without telling anyone?" Cyra, still leaning against him, made a small sound that could have been an apology or a confession. "I had to come." Kalethor closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, as if those words had struck something very deep. Then, very slowly, he turned to Overia again. Now the king was looking at her in a completely different way. Not like she was a servant, not like she was an Omega, but like someone recognizing an impossible detail inside his own fate. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and took out a small ancient pendant, worn at the edges, with a symbol finely carved in the center. Overia felt her heart beat harder before she even understood why. She knew that mark. Not from a place she could name, but she knew it. As if she had touched that design in a dream. As if she had heard someone speak her name with the same weight in another life. Kalethor held the pendant up in the low barn light. The metal gave a faint vibration, almost imperceptible, but enough to make him even more serious. "It reacted," he said, voice low. Overia frowned. "To what?" Kalethor held her gaze for too long. "To you." The silence that followed seemed to expand between the three of them. Cyra lifted her eyes slowly, sensing the shift in the room's energy, still resting against the king, and Overia, feeling both the cold of the straw and the strange warmth of the touch that had just helped save the wolf, had a disturbing certainty. This was not just an encounter. It was the beginning of something that already knew her before she had fully existed inside her own life. She looked at the pendant, then at Kalethor, then at Cyra, and thought, with the exhausted humor of someone who had been humiliated enough not to be impressed easily. Perfect. I slept in the barn, rescued the king's sacred wolf, and somehow ended the night with a cursed object. That was really the last thing missing before I officially became a tragedy. By sunrise, the barn no longer felt like pure punishment. It still smelled like cold straw, old wood, and the kind of misery that clung to everything in that fortress. But something had shifted. Overia was no longer alone, and that made the cold feel different. Cyra slept a few feet away, wrapped in the blanket Overia had dragged over to her after the king left. One hand rested over her belly, her breathing steadier now, her face still pale but calmer than the night before. Overia had not slept at all. Every time she tried, her mind reminded her that the king had looked at her like she mattered, which was deeply suspicious. It also reminded her that Cyra had followed an impossible instinct straight into the cold, and that the pendant had reacted to her. Her life had not become less complicated. It had simply become more organized around the chaos. Cyra stirred first. Her eyes opened slowly, and when she looked at Overia, there was that same quiet, tired awareness she had carried the night before. "Morning," Overia said. Cyra glanced around the barn. "This is not where I was sleeping." Sharp observation. We should keep that talent in mind. That earned the faintest hint of a smile. Overia handed her the water jug. Outside, the fortress had already begun its usual day. Footsteps, voices, carts, the ordinary life of people who had never been asked to sleep on a cold floor to remember their place. Overia stretched her back and immediately regretted it. "If I stand up too fast, I may see God." Cyra took a sip and looked at her over the rim of the jug. "Is that a threat or a complaint? Depends on whether God has breakfast." This time Cyra laughed. Before the moment could settle, the barn door opened. Kalethor stepped inside, looking as if he had not slept either. His exhaustion was controlled, neatly folded into the lines of his face. But the moment his eyes landed on Cyra, his expression softened. "You should have sent for me," he said. Cyra lifted one brow. "And let your entire household watch you panic? Absolutely not." Overia bit the inside of her cheek. Kalethor's mouth twitched. "I do not panic." Overia made a small sound. Both of them looked at her. She lifted a hand, innocently enough to be insulting. "I'm just saying, if last night was you not panicking, I'd hate to see your actual distress." To her surprise, Kalethor let out a short laugh through his nose. Small, but real. It landed harder than it should have. Overia looked away quickly, suddenly fascinated by a straw bundle near her boot. Kalethor moved closer to Cyra and crouched beside her. "How do you feel?" "Better than I did last night." "That is not a real answer." It is if you're trying to be difficult. Overia watched them from the corner of her eye. Their bond was quiet but deep, built from trust, from habit, from 1,000 choices made under pressure. It was impossible not to notice. And still, whenever Kalethor looked at Overia, the air shifted. It annoyed her that she noticed. It annoyed her more that she liked it. His gaze fell on the blanket around her shoulders and the frost still clinging to the barn boards. "You stayed here all night?" Overia shrugged. "It seemed rude to leave after I'd already been blamed for everything." Cyra's ears tipped back. Kalethor's jaw tightened. "No one should have left you here alone." There was something so blunt in the way he said it that Overia had no defense ready. So she used humor. "If you'd like to file a complaint with administration, I believe Mina keeps the forms under things that do not exist for people like me." Kalethor's face darkened, not with anger at her, with something sharper. Cyra seemed to catch it too. The room tightened around a truth nobody had said aloud yet. Kalethor stood. "Mina has been informed that you are no longer to be assigned to the Wolf's Chambers without my approval." Overia blinked. "That sounds suspiciously like protection." "It is protection." "That's unfortunate. I was hoping for an apology and maybe a snack." Despite himself, Kalethor almost smiled. Then a new voice came from the doorway. "Your Majesty, I was told you were here." A tall, neatly dressed man stood in the frame, holding a clipboard and wearing the kind of smile that made Overia distrust him instantly. Kalethor's voice turned cool. "Aaron?" The man bowed shallowly. "I came because Mina reported an incident involving the herbs, the barn, and a possible breach in routine care." Overia's stomach dropped. So that was the shape of it. She had seen men like him before, the kind who never raised a hand because they preferred paperwork, leverage, and quiet lies. The sort who could ruin a life with a few polished sentences and sleep just fine afterward. He looked at her with a soft, polite smile that was somehow worse than open contempt. "You must be the Omega in question." Overia folded her arms. "And you must be the person who says routine like it's a weapon." Aaron smiled wider. "I only care about order." "That's cute. I care about goats more than you do." Cyra made a sound that might have been a laugh. Aaron ignored it. "The King's Wolf left her chambers last night without escort. There will need to be an inquiry." Kalethor's voice went cold. "There will not be." She was unwell, and followed an instinct no one here had the sense to understand. That was the first time he had spoken about what happened as if it mattered. Aaron's smile barely shifted. "Of course, Your Majesty. I only mean that the household must be careful. Confusion breeds rumors." Overia heard the edge in his words. Not a threat. Worse. He was already turning the story in his head so she would be the problem. Kalethor's expression became unreadable. Aaron continued, still pleasant. "Especially when certain members of the staff are already under scrutiny." Kalethor turned slowly toward him. "Say what you mean." Aaron paused, then said it with perfect calm. "The Omega in the barn has been without a proper assignment for months. She sleeps in the cold. She speaks out of turn. She has no family advocate. If this becomes public, it may be difficult to explain why she was permitted near the Queen's chambers at all." Overia went cold. There it was. Not an attack on her body. An attack on her place in the world. He wasn't accusing her of a crime. He was making her sound like the kind of woman around whom one could happen. Overia gave a short, humorless laugh. "Oh, good. I was worried today would go by without someone explaining my own existence to me." Aaron gave her that same polished little smile. "You should be grateful. There are many places where someone in your position would not be heard at all, and yet somehow you've managed to speak for 3 minutes without saying anything useful. That's impressive." Kalethor looked like he might smile, but he stayed dangerous. Then Aaron did something worse. He read from the clipboard, as if discussing the weather. There is also the herb vial found in the hall last night. The label was misplaced. Mina believes it may have come from the Omega's station. If so, the error cannot simply be overlooked because of sentimental circumstances. Cyra shifted. Overia understood the real target immediately. Not the vial, her credibility. Aaron was building the kind of story where every mistake around him pointed back to her. Not because he feared her, because she was convenient, small enough to blame, isolated enough to bury. Kalethor stepped forward. Aaron stayed still, but Overia could see the satisfaction in his eyes. He wanted the king angry, messy, easy to spin. Instead, Kalethor said quietly, "You are finished here." Aaron blinked. "Your Majesty." "You heard me." The smile at Aaron's mouth slipped, just slightly. Enough. Kalethor's gaze stayed locked on him. "You will not speak to her like that again. You will not use her position as permission to degrade her. And you will not build a story around this incident before I have understood it myself." The barn went still. Overia had expected authority, maybe anger. Not this. Not the deliberate defense of her dignity. It left her throat tight. Aaron recovered with visible effort. "I only want what is best for the household." Kalethor didn't blink. "Then leave." Aaron's gaze flicked once to Overia. Not anger, something worse, interest. As if he had already decided she would be worth damaging later. He bowed and stepped out. Only then did the barn feel like it could breathe again. Overia looked at Kalethor, still unsettled by the strange heat in her chest. "You didn't have to do that." Kalethor turned to her. "Yes, I did." The answer came too fast, and somehow that was worse. Because his eyes were on her in a way that made the room feel smaller. He was tired, worried, and still carrying that steady attention that made the air between them feel like a held breath. Overia disliked how seen that made her feel. She hated unfair things. Cyra shifted on the straw. "Whoever that was, he's been smiling at me like a knife for weeks." Overia laughed once. "That is the best way I've ever heard a bureaucrat described." Kalethor looked between them and, for the first time, smiled for real. Then Cyra inhaled sharply and touched her belly. Overia moved at once. "What is it?" Cyra listened to herself for a second. "I felt a pull again." Kalethor's expression changed. Not panic. Something older. Something instinctive. Cyra looked at Overia, then the king, then down at the straw, as if trying to understand the feeling without naming it. "It felt like I needed to come here." Overia swallowed. Kalethor looked at her carefully. "You feel it too. Not a question." Overia hesitated, then admitted it. "I think so." Kalethor studied her with a new kind of focus, and somewhere beyond the barn, Aaron was already moving pieces into place. Overia did not know what he wanted yet. But she knew men like him. He would not strike first. He would wait. He would poison the room, the story, the trust. And that, Overia thought, was its own kind of violence. Kalethor held her gaze one beat too long. Then he said quietly, "Whatever that pendant is, it brought me here for a reason." Overia's pulse jumped, and because the universe apparently refused to let her have one normal minute, she looked at him and said the first thing that came to mind. "Great. So I'm cold, poor, falsely accused, and apparently part of a magical shipping problem." Cyra laughed. Kalethor stared at her for a long second. Then, finally, the corner of his mouth lifted. A real smile. Small, unexpected, and enough to make Overia's knees forget their job. Outside, the fortress kept moving. Inside, the barn had become the first place in her life where being impossible had started to look interesting. The barn was no longer empty by the time the sun reached its highest point. That alone should have made Overia nervous. Instead, it made her tired. She was sitting on the overturned wooden crate by the wall, one ankle crossed over the other, trying to coax warmth back into her fingers with the same stubborn optimism she used for every miserable thing in her life. Cyra was resting nearby, still wrapped in the blanket, still pale from the strain of the previous night, but steadier now. The wolf had insisted she was fine every time Overia asked, which had already become suspiciously familiar. Overia trusted almost no one who said they were fine too quickly, especially in a barn, especially after midnight. The morning had barely settled before the fortress began remembering it had a king inside it. Doors opened. Voices sharpened. Servants started moving faster than their own thoughts. Somewhere beyond the walls, the whole place seemed to draw itself straighter, as if the air had learned respect by fear. Overia had just stood up to stretch when Kalethor returned. He entered without ceremony, though the room still reacted to him as if he had brought his own weather. He looked cleaner than he had the day before, but not rested. His face carried that same controlled exhaustion, the kind that lived in the jaw and the shoulders and behind the eyes of men who never had the luxury of collapsing where anyone could see them. Cyra lifted her head immediately. Kalethor's expression softened at once. "How are you feeling?" "Like I spent the night in a barn." Overia made a noise that might have been a laugh. Kalethor looked at her. "I'm not sure whether that was a complaint or a diagnosis." "It was both," Overia said. "I contain multitudes." That got the faintest twitch at the corner of his mouth. Overia hated that she noticed. It was deeply inconvenient to be attracted to someone who looked at her like he was trying to decide whether she was clever, brave, or a problem that had not yet been properly categorized. Kalethor crouched beside Cyra and checked her forehead with the back of his hand. "Still warm. I'm pregnant, not made of ice. That remains to be seen." Overia turned away before her smile became obvious. There was something almost tender in the way he spoke to Cyra. Not indulgent, not soft in the way weak men were soft, but careful, loyal, familiar. It told Overia something important about him, even before she knew all of it. He did not just command. He stayed. That was rarer than people admitted. Kalethor looked up at her. "You slept at all?" Overia snorted. "I came very close. Then my life happened again." His eyes held hers for half a beat too long. "You should have had a bed." She lifted one shoulder. "I'm beginning to suspect your household has not been updated for fairness." Before he could answer, footsteps sounded outside. Not hurried, measured. Overia straightened instinctively. A man appeared in the doorway with a clipboard and the expression of someone who believed neat handwriting could excuse bad intentions. He was older than most of the guards, thin in the polished way people got when they were used to winning arguments with procedures instead of consequences. Aaron. Overia knew the type instantly. The ones who never had to raise a hand because they preferred leverage, omission, and smiling at the exact wrong time. His gaze flicked to her, then to Cyra, then to Kalethor. "Your Majesty, I was informed the wolf was found here again." Kalethor's tone cooled. "She came here on her own." Aaron nodded as if that answer only deepened the problem. "Of course, that is precisely what concerns me." Overia crossed her arms. "That's funny. You don't look concerned. You look like you iron your own bad news." Cyra let out a quiet sound that was almost a laugh. Aaron's smile remained fixed. "The household is already talking. The wolf left her chambers without escort. The Omega was with her. There are questions now." Overia's stomach sank. Questions. That elegant little word people used when they wanted to smear someone without admitting they were doing it. Kalethor stood slowly. "Then let me answer them before you decorate them with your own version." Aaron inclined his head. "Naturally, though the matter of the herb vial remains unresolved." Overia's eyes narrowed. There it was. He had come with a second blade already hidden behind the first. Aaron continued, voice polite enough to be poisonous. Mina believes the vial found in the hall may have come from the Omega's station. If that is true, then some explanation will be required. Overia laughed once, short and dry. You mean after I was sent to sleep in the cold with a blanket thinner than a bad apology? Aaron turned to her with that same courteous expression. I mean that errors have consequences, so do lies, Overia said. Kalethor looked at her then, and for one sharp second, she understood he liked the fact that she did not shrink. Aaron's eyes moved to the king. If the staff begins thinking rules apply only to the inconvenient, order will suffer. Kalethor's voice dropped. Order did not suffer last night. Your priorities did. The barn went still. Overia could almost feel the tension pivot. Aaron did not flinch, but she saw it. He had not expected Kalethor to defend her openly again, especially not this quickly. That was when Overia understood the real shape of him. Aaron did not attack with anger. He attacked with respectability. He wanted to turn her into a liability, a rumor, a detail too embarrassing for the room to support. He wasn't trying to crush her in public. He was trying to make everyone believe she belonged under the floor. And that was worse, because it worked so often. Overia raised her chin. If you're done circling me like I'm a stain, I'd like to point out that I was not the one wandering around at night, sick and alone, while everyone else slept in warm rooms. Aaron's smile sharpened. No, but you were the one present when she did. Overia blinked once. Oh, that was the game, not blame. Association. He wanted the whole fortress to begin speaking her name beside incident until she became the cause by repetition alone. Kalethor stepped forward. Leave. Aaron stayed still. Your Majesty, now. There was nothing loud in Kalethor's voice, but the barn seemed to understand it. Even Cyra went quiet. Aaron bowed, neat as a blade. Of course. But before he stepped out, his eyes lingered on Overia. Not with rage, with interest. Overia knew that look too. It was the expression of someone deciding she would be worth damaging later. When he was gone, the air loosened just enough to breathe. Cyra exhaled slowly. He smiles like a knife. Overia barked out a laugh before she could stop herself. That is the most accurate thing anyone has ever said about a bureaucrat. Kalethor looked between them, and to Overia's frustration, the corner of his mouth lifted. It made him look younger. More dangerous, too, because it revealed what the rest of him worked so hard to conceal. He turned back to her. You are not being reassigned to the wolf's chambers without my approval. Overia blinked. That sounds suspiciously like protection. It is protection. I was hoping for an apology and maybe food. This time he almost smiled fully. Almost. Then Cyra shifted, one hand moving to her belly. Overia was beside her at once. What is it? Cyra held still for a moment, listening to something only she could feel. The same pull as before. Kalethor's expression changed. Overia saw it immediately. Not panic. Something deeper. A response from somewhere instinctive and ancient, as if the three of them had stepped closer to a thread already waiting to be pulled. Cyra looked at Overia, then at the king. It feels like I'm supposed to be here. Overia swallowed. Kalethor held her gaze. And you? She almost joked. Almost. Instead, she answered honestly. I think I feel it too. That silence after her words felt alive. Outside, somewhere deeper in the fortress, Aaron was already working. Overia could feel it in the shape of the day. The kind of man he was did not need a raised voice to cause harm. He only needed time, a witness, and a story that sounded almost believable. Kalethor looked at her as if he had heard something more than she said. Then quietly, whatever that pendant is, it brought me here for a reason. Overia stared at him, then let out a breath that was half disbelief, half defeat. Great. So I'm cold, poor, falsely accused, and apparently part of a magical problem I didn't order. Cyra laughed. Kalethor smiled for real this time. And for one brief, impossible moment, the barn felt less like a punishment and more like the beginning of something none of them had named yet. By midday, the barn had become the most watched place in the fortress. That fact alone irritated Overia. She stood just inside the doorway with a bundle of blankets in her arms, trying very hard not to look like someone whose entire life had become a rumor with walls. The cold had eased a little, but not enough to matter. The straw still smelled damp. The floor still complained under every step. And now, on top of all that, people kept appearing, pretending they were there for some harmless reason while clearly trying to see whether the Omega in the barn had somehow become interesting overnight. Overia was not used to being interesting. Interesting people got invited places. Interesting people got warm meals. Interesting people did not get blamed for every vile, every delay, every bad mood in a fortress full of overpaid liars. Cyra was resting on the pallet again, calmer than before, one hand over her belly, eyes half closed. Kalethor had finally gone to deal with whatever disaster his household called planning, but not before warning everyone within hearing distance that the wolf and Overia were to be left undisturbed, which, Overia had discovered, was another way of saying everyone was now dying to know exactly what was happening in the barn. She crouched beside Cyra and lowered the blanket carefully. If one more person asks whether I am needed in a tone like that, I may become a threat to regional stability. Cyra's eyes opened. Regional stability? I'm trying to think bigger. That earned a tired smile. Overia had barely straightened when footsteps sounded outside again. She looked up. Not Aaron this time. Mina. The woman entered with a stiff face and the expression of someone determined to look offended by other people's existence. Behind her came two servants carrying a small tray of broth, which made Overia suspicious immediately, because kindness in the fortress usually arrived with strings tied to it. Mina set the tray down a little too sharply. The king ordered food brought here. Overia folded her arms. So he does know I require calories. I was beginning to think I was a decorative concept. Mina ignored that. Her gaze moved to Cyra, then back to Overia. I heard the wolf came here again on her own. You heard correctly. And that she was unwell. Also correct. Mina's eyes narrowed in the way of a person who wanted to ask the wrong question and get away with pretending it was the right one. You should not encourage this. Overia tilted her head. Encourage what? Breathing? Walking? Existing in a place with cold floors and better manners than some people? Mina's mouth pressed into a line. Do not be clever with me. Overia's smile was small and sharp. Then don't be obvious. That drew a low, amused sound from Cyra. Mina ignored both of them and turned her attention to the tray. The kitchen is short on supplies. This is all there is for now. Overia looked at the broth, then at the woman. All there is doing a lot of work in that sentence. Mina gave her a flat look. You have a problem with it? I have a problem with the fact that a pregnant wolf is getting the same meal I'd give a sick sparrow. Mina's eyes cooled. Then you should have chosen your place in the fortress more carefully. There it was again. That polite little cruelty. The kind that sounded like advice and landed like a door closing. Overia felt her jaw tighten. Before she could answer, Cyra shifted and spoke in a quiet voice. She was not the one who chose the barn. Mina looked at her, startled by the interruption. Overia went still. Cyra's tone remained calm, but there was steel beneath it. If you have brought food, leave it. If you have brought judgment, take it back with you. For a moment, the barn was silent. Mina's expression changed just enough to show she had not expected the wolf to intervene. She recovered quickly, of course. People like her always did. As you wish, my lady. She left the tray and turned toward the door, but not before glancing at Overia one last time. Try not to cause another scene. Overia stared at her back. Then she muttered without looking up. I'm beginning to suspect scenes happen around me like weather. Cyra made a small sound that was clearly a laugh. The servants left. Mina left. The barn returned to its uneasy quiet. Overia exhaled, then reached for the broth. Well, that was warm and terrible. Cyra opened one eye. You're getting very skilled at describing this household. I learned from experience. It's one of my few formal educations. She handed the bowl to Cyra, who accepted it with both hands and drank slowly. The simple sight of that, the king's wolf, swollen with life, sitting in a cold barn and taking broth from the same hands that had been insulted 10 minutes earlier, made something tighten in Overia's chest. Not pity. Something more dangerous. Recognition. She understood what it meant to be placed somewhere cruel and then expected to make it survivable. A sound outside interrupted her thoughts. Not footsteps this time. Hooves. Overia turned just as a messenger's horse skidded to a stop near the courtyard. The rider shouted something to the guards. Instantly, the entire fortress shifted into motion, the way it always did when news arrived dressed like urgency. Kalethor was back before the messenger had even dismounted. He entered the barn fast, eyes sharp, posture tense in a way that told Overia the day had changed, and nobody had bothered to ask permission. What happened? Cyra asked at once. Kalethor did not answer her immediately. His gaze went to the tray, then to Overia, then to the door. That was enough to make her suspicious. That look means trouble, she said. He looked at her. That look means I've already had trouble and would prefer not to pay interest. Overia sighed. So, trouble. That got the faintest flicker of amusement from him, but it vanished quickly. He stepped closer and lowered his voice. Aaron has filed a formal concern about your presence here. Overia stared at him. Of course he has. He says your access to the wolf's chambers was unauthorized, your assignment unclear, and your involvement in last night's incident difficult to justify. Overia gave a slow, disbelieving exhale. He writes like a man who has never once been hit with a frying pan by an honest cook. Kalethor's mouth twitched, but his eyes stayed serious. He is trying to make this into a question of procedure. No, he's trying to make me into a question. Kalethor said nothing. That silence was answer enough. Overia looked down at the blanket in her hands and felt something colder than the room settle into place. She had known people would try to twist the story. She had known it from the beginning. But hearing it named that plainly made it worse. Cyra's voice was quiet. He does this often? Kalethor's jaw tightened. He prefers damage that can be denied. Overia glanced up at that. There it was, the real shape of the antagonist. Not loud, not physical, patient. Aaron did not need fists. He needed systems, witnesses, and the kind of cruelty that could still call itself care. Overia let out a small breath. Wonderful. My favorite kind of enemy. The sort who smiles while sharpening paperwork. Kalethor looked at her then, and something in his face softened despite the stress. I am not letting him take this from you. The words landed harder than they should have. Overia hated that they mattered. Hated that she believed him. Hated even more that she did not feel foolish for doing so. She crossed her arms to hide the way her hands had gone tense. That was almost noble. Almost. You still look like you're planning 3 impossible things and one of them involves me standing somewhere I'm not supposed to. That finally got a real smile out of him. Cyra watched them both, eyes half-lidded with exhaustion and amusement. I can leave you two alone if this is going to become unbearable. Overia choked on a laugh. Kalethor turned immediately to Cyra. You are not moving. I wasn't offering to move. I was offering to spare my ears. Overia laughed outright this time, and Kalethor, despite himself, gave in to a brief, helpless smile. For a moment, the tension eased. Then the barn door creaked open again. This time, it was one of the guards. "Your Majesty, he's asking for the staff ledger." Kalethor's expression cooled at once. "Tell him no." The guard hesitated. "He says the refusal will look like—" "I do not care what it looks like to a man who prefers appearances to truth." The guard bowed and left. Overia felt a strange warmth beneath her ribs at that. Kalethor was not only defending her directly, he was refusing the frame Aaron wanted to force around her. That mattered. A great deal, actually. The king turned back to her. "He'll try again." "Of course he will. People like him confuse persistence with morality." That earned another quick glance of approval from Kalethor. Overia noticed. Of course she did. That was the problem. He made noticing him feel like a habit she had not consented to, but was developing anyway. Cyra shifted and frowned slightly, one hand again resting over her belly. Immediately, Overia was beside her. "Pain?" Cyra shook her head. "No, just movement. Stronger than before." Kalethor moved closer, all concern now. Overia watched the two of them and felt the strange pull from the night before settle in again. Quieter this time, but still there. Not fear. Not exactly. More like the edge of a path she had not expected to find. Cyra looked at her. "It comes and goes when you are near." Overia blinked. "That is either very flattering or deeply strange." Kalethor's gaze lifted. "It's both." She glanced at him, and that was a mistake, because the way he said it made the space between them feel too small. Overia cleared her throat and looked away. "Excellent. I was hoping to become both flattering and strange before lunch." Cyra laughed softly. Kalethor smiled, just barely. And in that moment, Overia could feel something growing between them that had nothing to do with rank or obligation. It was not heat in the obvious sense. It was quieter, deeper. The sort of chemistry that didn't ask for permission because it was already rooted somewhere beneath the surface. Then Kalethor's face changed, not dramatically, just enough. He had noticed something. "What?" Overia asked. He looked at the blanket in her hands, then at the floor near the door. "Your footprints." Overia frowned. "What about them?" He bent down slightly, studying the edge of the packed dirt. "There are 2 sets near the threshold." Overia's blood cooled. Cyra followed his gaze. "Mine?" she asked softly. Kalethor shook his head once. "No. Yours and someone else's. Someone who came close to the barn after the others left." Overia stared. The air in the room seemed to narrow. Kalethor stood slowly. "Aaron." The name landed with weight. Overia's pulse quickened, but not from fear alone. From understanding. Aaron had been here. Not loudly. Not obviously. Quietly. That meant he had been watching. Listening. Measuring. Of course he had. He would never strike directly if he could instead collect pieces and wait until she had nowhere to stand. Overia let out a dry breath. "Great. So now I'm not just under suspicion. I'm under observation." Kalethor met her eyes. "Not by me." That should have felt comforting. It did, more than she wanted to admit. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "He wants you isolated. He wants the fortress to think you are unstable, untrusted, and easy to dismiss." Overia looked at him for a long moment, then gave a small, humorless smile. He's not wrong about the easy-to-dismiss part. Kalethor's gaze sharpened. No. The answer came immediately. Absolute. It startled her. He held her eyes. "You are not easy to dismiss." Something in Overia's chest went tight and warm at the same time. She hated how much that mattered. She hated that it mattered because it sounded like belief. Real belief. Not pity. Not duty. Something better. Cyra watched the two of them in silence, then let out a long, low breath. If you two are done exchanging meaningful looks, I would appreciate more broth. Overia turned so fast it broke the moment in half. Of course, absolutely. Broth. Very serious matter. Kalethor actually laughed then, brief and quiet, and the sound did something unforgivable to her focus. The rest of the afternoon passed in pieces. Overia fetched water. Kalethor left to answer Aaron's formal complaint. Cyra rested. The barn stayed cold. The fortress kept breathing around them like a machine that had not yet noticed one of its gears was becoming dangerous. But when the sun began to fall, Overia saw it clearly. Aaron had not come for the ledger. He had come to count her weaknesses, and by the time he was done, he would try to use them to separate her from the only two people in the fortress who had begun to see her as something more than a mistake. Overia looked out toward the darkening courtyard and frowned. Then, because the world apparently had not finished being unreasonable, she muttered to herself, "Wonderful. I've moved from humiliated in a barn to emotionally interesting to the king, to actively audited by a smiling bureaucrat. Honestly, I'm due a raise." By the time the morning bells had finished echoing through the fortress, Overia had already saved the household from itself twice. The first time had been small, almost invisible. A kettle left too close to a brazier in the outer washroom, steam building faster than the servant assigned to it could notice. Overia had passed by, smelled the scorching iron, and moved the kettle off the heat before it could boil over and ruin the whole basin. The servant had blinked at her like she'd just performed sorcery. The second time had been less polite. A tray of infusion leaves for Cyra had arrived with 2 wrong bundles mixed into the herbs, both of them harmless on their own, but disastrous together. Overia had caught it before the mixture ever reached the sacred wolf's chambers, and now she was standing in the corridor with the offending bundles pinched between her fingers like they had personally offended her. This place is one gust of bad judgment away from becoming a museum of preventable disasters, she muttered. Mina, who had been unfortunate enough to hear her, drew herself up with the expression of a woman determined to make every word feel like an insult. The herbs were checked. Overia glanced at her, then at the tray. "Then your checker needs glasses, a better attitude, or both." A maid at the far end of the corridor snorted before she could stop herself. Mina's eyes sharpened. "Watch your tone." "I am watching it. It's the only thing in this fortress that seems to be doing its job." That earned a second, quieter laugh from someone near the doorway. Overia did not look back. She had learned long ago that the quickest way to survive people like Mina was to refuse to give them the satisfaction of seeing their effect. She set the herbs aside and turned toward Cyra's chamber. The sacred wolf was resting near the window, draped in layered blankets, her pregnant belly heavy but calm. The room around her was warm, bright, and full of the quiet kind of care usually reserved for relics and royalty. Not because she was fragile, because she was valued. Sacred wolves like Cyra were not treated as pets or servants. They were rare, speaking beings, linked to old bloodlines and guarded with the kind of reverence most people only gave to holy things and dangerous storms. Cyra lifted her head when Overia entered. "You look like you've already threatened someone today." Overia lowered the tray. "Only spiritually." Cyra's mouth curved, small, amused, tired. That expression still surprised Overia a little. It was impossible not to like someone who could be pregnant, revered by the entire realm, and still find room to enjoy a joke that was mostly made of bad temper. "These are wrong," Overia said, holding up the herbs. Cyra looked at them, then at her. "Can you fix them?" "I can fix almost anything if nobody watches me too closely." That sounds less like confidence and more like a warning. Those are often the same thing in my profession. Cyra gave a low, breathy laugh. Overia started sorting the herbs properly, fingers moving quickly and precisely. She worked with the sharp, practical focus that came from having spent most of her life being useful in rooms where nobody thanked her for it. It was familiar, almost comforting in the way of old habits. But the room changed when Kalethor stepped inside a few moments later. Not dramatically, just enough. He didn't bring noise with him, but the air adjusted anyway. The king looked tired, as he often did lately, though his weariness seemed to live under the skin rather than on it. His coat was dark, his hair slightly loosened from its tie, and his expression held that same careful attention Overia had started noticing more often when she was in the room. He took in the herbs first, then Overia, then Cyra. "Problem?" he asked. Overia did not look up right away. "Minor," which means it would have become catastrophic if left unattended. Kalethor's gaze flicked to the missorted bundles. "Whose mistake?" Overia made a face. "If I answer that honestly, we'll spend the next hour pretending the answer is not obvious." Cyra let out a faint sound of amusement. Kalethor's mouth twitched. "I'm beginning to think you enjoy being difficult." Overia finally looked at him. "I enjoy being correct. The rest is just a side effect." That got a real smile out of him, brief but undeniable. It was enough to warm the space between them in a way that was becoming increasingly inconvenient. Before he could say anything else, the door behind him opened again. Aaron entered with a stack of ledgers under one arm and the expression of a man who'd never once been caught making a mess because he preferred to do it on paper. Overia saw his face tighten the instant he spotted her at the table. There he was. The fortress's favorite type of cruelty. Polished, patient, and smiling. "Your Majesty," Aaron said, bowing slightly. His gaze moved very briefly to Overia. "I was told there was a disruption in the herb delivery." Overia kept sorting. Kalethor answered first. "There was a mistake. A trivial one, I hope." Overia looked up at that. "If it had been trivial, nobody would have tried to hide it behind your favorite word, which I'm assuming is order." Aaron smiled, just enough to make the expression feel sharpened. "We all serve order in different ways." "Some of us do it by actually helping people," Overia said. "Wild concept, I know." Kalethor's eyes remained on Aaron, but Overia caught the edge of approval in the king's face. He liked that she did not fold. Aaron turned the ledger in his hand. "Speaking of helping, I've come to adjust the staffing schedule. Since the barn incident, there's been some unnecessary attention." Overia stiffened. Cyra noticed immediately. "Unnecessary to whom?" the sacred wolf asked quietly. Aaron kept his tone smooth. "To the household. Questions arise when a staff member without official standing is repeatedly found near the king's sacred wolf." Overia set down the herbs. There it was. Not accusation, not directly. Worse, a velvet kind of attack, the sort that didn't need fists because it worked through implication, through making her sound improper, temporary, suspect. Kalethor's voice cooled. "Overia is not a risk." Aaron bowed his head the slightest bit. "Of course not, Your Majesty. Still, perception matters." Overia let out a short laugh. "That's rich coming from a man whose face looks like it was assembled entirely out of perception." The maid by the doorway nearly choked on her own breath. Aaron's smile thinned. "It would be wise to remember your position." "I do remember it," Overia said. "Apparently, I'm the one everyone sends to the cold when they want to feel important." Kalethor's jaw flexed. Aaron glanced at him, then back at her. "No one is attacking you." Overia stared at him for a beat, then nodded slowly. "That's what makes you dangerous. You say it so calmly that people start wondering whether they imagined the blade." The room went very still. Cyra's gaze shifted between them. Kalethor stepped forward a fraction. Aaron, for the first time, looked mildly irritated. Not enough to show anger, just enough to reveal he had not expected Overia to speak with such precision. He opened the ledger and continued, as if the conversation had remained civilized. I've also revised the access list for the chamber corridor. Fewer unnecessary crossings, more discipline. Overia glanced at the page, then at the tray, then at Cyra, then back at Aaron. You changed the access list after the herb mix-up. To improve efficiency. No, to make it look like I'm the inconvenience. Aaron's eyes held hers. If you were indispensable, there would be no need for my involvement. That was the kind of cruelty she hated most. Not loud, not messy. Clean enough to pass as reason. Overia smiled without humor. Congratulations. You've managed to say something ugly while pretending it's administrative. Kalethor took the ledger from Aaron's hand before the man could react. The motion was calm, controlled, more dangerous for it. He looked at the page once, then again. Then he looked at Aaron. You altered this without speaking to me. Aaron's face stayed composed, but just barely. I acted in the household's interest. You acted in your own. It was quiet, but the words landed hard. Overia's pulse lifted slightly. This was the part she was beginning to trust in Kalethor. He didn't need to perform protection to make it real. He could say one line and cut through someone's entire disguise. Aaron turned his attention to Overia again, and the smile he offered her was almost courteous. Almost. You seem very certain of your value. Overia met his gaze without blinking. No, I'm certain of yours. That's the problem. A sharp breath escaped the servant at the doorway. Kalethor's mouth twitched, and this time it did not go unnoticed. Aaron recovered with visible effort. Your Majesty, if the Omega continues to interfere with logistics, it will invite more questions. Overia's eyes flashed. I didn't interfere. I prevented a mistake from reaching a pregnant sacred wolf, whose entire value to this realm is apparently too complicated for your paperwork to grasp. Kalethor looked at her then. Really looked. There was respect in his eyes, yes, but also something deeper. The unmistakable recognition of a person who had seen through the noise and chosen to stand anyway. That recognition made her chest tighten in a way she did not care to examine too closely. Cyra, perhaps sensing the tension was reaching a dangerous peak, took a measured breath and said softly, She is the reason I am not eating spoiled tea right now. Overia glanced at her. The wolf's voice was calm, but firm. A choice. An alignment. Aaron's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. He had not expected Cyra to take Overia's side so quickly. That was another thing about him. He wanted control over the story, and every time Overia or Cyra interrupted that story, he grew more careful, not less. Kalethor set the ledger down. The staffing list stays as it is until I review it myself. Aaron bowed again, but the gesture was tighter now. Of course. He moved toward the door, then paused just long enough to glance at Overia with the faintest suggestion of warning, not threat. A calculation. He was already thinking about the next way to make her look like the problem. When the door shut behind him, the room loosened a little. Overia exhaled slowly and picked up the herbs again. I dislike him on principle now. Cyra's mouth curved. That was fast. I'm efficient. Kalethor looked at her, and there was a quiet amusement in his expression now, mixed with something else he did not bother hiding as well when she was in the room. You handled him well. Overia snorted. Well is generous. I'm mostly powered by spite and a deep respect for proper tea. Cyra actually laughed this time. Kalethor did too, though more softly. For a moment the tension eased. Then the sacred wolf suddenly inhaled sharply, one hand going to her belly. Overia was at her side instantly. Cyra? The wolf blinked, then frowned, listening to her body. A strong movement, that's all. Kalethor stepped closer. Overia watched him check on Cyra with that same careful attentiveness, the same steadiness, and felt the familiar strange tug in her chest again. Not because the scene was romantic, It wasn't. It was something else. Something sacred. Something rooted in years of trust between the king and his revered wolf. And yet, when Kalethor turned to Overia a second later, the temperature in the room shifted in a different way entirely. "You noticed the herb problem before anyone else," he said. Overia lifted one shoulder. "I notice a lot of things." His eyes stayed on hers. "I'm starting to see that." The line was simple enough to be harmless. It wasn't. It sat between them with the weight of something unspoken, a recognition, a beginning. Overia pretended to focus on the herbs again, because that was safer than acknowledging the fact that the king had just looked at her like she was becoming impossible to ignore. Outside, the fortress went on pretending it was orderly. Inside, Aaron was already arranging his next quiet cruelty. And Overia, who had been punished for being too small, too strange, and too useless, found herself thinking one very clear thought. If the castle wanted a problem, it had chosen the wrong Omega. By the next morning, the fortress had developed a new habit, pretending not to watch Overia while watching her constantly. She noticed. Of course she did. It was hard not to notice when servants turned their heads too quickly as she passed, when two guards went silent mid-conversation, when even the kitchen staff looked like they were waiting to see whether the king's Omega, no, the king's sacred wolf's helper, no, the exiled little problem from the barn, would finally do something that justified all the attention. Overia carried a basket of clean cloths down the corridor and muttered under her breath, "I wasn't aware I'd become a seasonal event." A maid walking beside her gave her a startled glance. Overia smiled at her. "Don't worry, I also hate it." That earned a reluctant snort. She had just reached the side hall leading toward Cyra's chamber when she heard raised voices ahead. Not angry, exactly, but urgent enough to make her stop. Kalethor's voice first. Then Aaron's, measured and irritatingly calm. Overia set the basket down by the wall and moved closer, staying just out of sight. "I already told you," Kalethor said. "The corridor stays clear." "Which is exactly why I'm asking for a formal reassignment of the delivery route," Aaron replied. "The household will look disorganized if this continues." Overia frowned. "Delivery route?" She peered around the corner just enough to see the two men standing near the open archway to the inner wing. A pair of servants waited behind Aaron, each holding documents and a covered tray. Kalethor stood still, his posture sharp. "What delivery?" Aaron lifted the papers a fraction. "The spring inventory, the chamber linens, the supplemental tea stores. A few of the items assigned to the sacred wolf have been moved to the lower corridor for efficiency." Overia's eyes narrowed, moved, without warning, without consultation, without the person actually caring for Cyra in the room. She took one step forward before she could stop herself. The floor made the smallest sound. Both men turned. Aaron's eyes landed on her first, and that faint, polished smile returned to his mouth like a blade finding its sheath. Ah, perfect timing. Overia did not like that phrase. It had never once been used honestly in her presence. Kalethor's gaze moved to her. "What's wrong?" Overia looked from him to Aaron, then to the servants holding the trays. Then back to Aaron. "If you moved the tea stores, I hope you also moved the people who know how to make the tea." One of the servants blinked, confused. Aaron kept his voice even. "The household has procedures." Overia gave him a flat look. "Procedures are what people call mistakes when they want to pretend they have a filing system." Kalethor's mouth twitched, but he waited for her to continue. She gestured toward the trays. "What exactly got moved?" Aaron answered too quickly. "Nothing important." Overia's stare sharpened. That was answer enough. She crossed the hall, set her hand on the nearest tray, and lifted the cloth enough to smell the contents. Her face changed. Kalethor saw it immediately. "What?" Overia looked up. "The tea on this tray is wrong." The servant holding it stiffened. "It came from the stores. I know where it came from." Overia cut in, still looking at the contents. That's the problem. Aaron folded his hands behind his back. Explain. Overia lifted the cup, smelled it again, and gave a short, incredulous laugh. This is the one for sleep, not the one for endurance. Whoever switched them doesn't understand the difference between calming an overworked pregnant sacred wolf and sedating a person because you'd like them out of the way. The corridor went still. Cyra appeared in the doorway behind Kalethor, one hand resting at her belly, her ears angled forward in alert irritation. Sedating me? She asked mildly. Aaron's face did not change, but Overia saw it. A tiny crack of annoyance. Not because he'd been caught, because his plan had become visible. Kalethor's eyes went cold. Who moved the stores? Aaron did not answer. Overia did not need him to. She already knew the shape of what he'd done. He had not tried to hurt anyone physically. He had tried to displace the wrong tea, shift the wrong linen, and create a domestic problem that would look like carelessness on her part. If Cyra became drowsy or unwell, the blame would drift toward the person closest to the supplies, toward Overia. The cruelty was so neat, it almost impressed her. Almost. She looked at Aaron, unimpressed. You keep doing that thing where you make a problem and hope the rest of us will call it management. Aaron's expression stayed controlled. You're overreacting. Overia turned fully toward him. No, I'm reacting exactly enough. You change the tea to make her vulnerable, and then you plan to let the blame fall on me when someone noticed. The servants looked horrified. One of them actually stepped back. Aaron's voice remained smooth. You are making accusations based on intuition. Overia pointed at the tray. So does a bloodhound. It still doesn't make it wrong. Kalethor looked at the tray, then at Aaron, then at the servants. Overia could feel the shift in the room. This was the part Aaron had not counted on. Kalethor listening, not dismissing, not deflecting. Listening. Explain the root change, Kalethor said. Aaron's jaw tightened by a fraction. There was a supply issue. Then why was I not informed? I intended to report it after the adjustment. Overia laughed under her breath. He means after he'd already made the mess look intentional. Aaron finally looked at her directly. There it was again. The polite cruelty, the control, the quiet contempt. He was not trying to shout her down. He was trying to make her sound hysterical. You are very eager to be part of every conversation. Overia tilted her head. And you're very eager to move things around without telling the people who have to live with the consequences. We all have hobbies. Cyra, standing in the doorway, made a low sound that might have been a chuckle. Kalethor kept his eyes on Aaron. This is your doing. Aaron folded his lips into something almost like regret. I'm trying to keep the household functional. By altering medicines. By improving efficiency. Overia cut in. Efficiency is what people call it when they want to sound cleaner than, I made a power grab with tea. This time, Kalethor did smile. Only faintly, but enough to make Aaron's expression harden. That tiny shift in the king's face was important. Overia felt it. He was no longer merely annoyed. He was choosing sides more openly. And she knew Aaron saw it too. The antagonistic man straightened his papers. If the Omega is going to continue speaking this way in front of staff, it will create confusion. Overia stared at him. Then she glanced to the side table near the corridor wall. A second tray, another cup, a pitcher. She walked over, lifted the pitcher, and gave it a sniff. Her eyes narrowed. Then she set it down very carefully. You also shifted the spice water. Aaron did not answer. You want to know how I know? Overia asked, her voice now too calm to be accidental. Because this one has lavender in it, which is what you give to calm someone down when you want them compliant. But you mixed it with mint, which will make Cyra nauseous if she drinks it on an empty stomach. So either you're incompetent, or you're counting on everyone else being too polite to ask why the sacred wolf started feeling sick after your efficiency plan. The silence that followed was razor-thin. Kalethor's gaze moved to Aaron with open, unmistakable displeasure. Is that true? Aaron's face remained composed, but there was less shine to it now. The ingredients may have been changed by mistake. Overia laughed once. There it is. May have. That's the whole religion of people like you, isn't it? Aaron ignored the jab, but only barely. I'm surprised you are so eager to accuse someone who has done nothing but try to maintain order. Overia looked right at him. No, you're not surprised. You're counting on me being tired, small, and easy to talk over. The only mistake you made is assuming I don't know the difference between order and control. That landed. It landed because it was true, and because she said it without shaking. Cyra stepped forward then, still calm, still standing with the quiet authority that came naturally to her rare kind. I will not drink anything that has been improved by someone who did not consult the person drinking it. Overia almost smiled at that. Kalethor took the tray from the servant and set it aside with deliberate care. Then he looked at Aaron. Leave the corridor. Aaron's face went flat. Your Majesty? Now. Aaron held his gaze for a long beat, then bowed with the stiffness of a man who had not expected the room to refuse him. When he walked away, the corridor felt wider, not safe, just less poisoned. Overia let out a breath she had not noticed she was holding. Cyra looked at her, the corners of her eyes softening slightly. You saw that immediately. Overia shrugged one shoulder. He had, I ruined a life through office supplies, written all over him. That earned a real laugh from the sacred wolf. Kalethor turned to her, and in his expression was that same steady respect she had begun to recognize in him. Not the shallow approval people gave when she was useful, but the deeper kind that came from being seen correctly. Good catch. Overia looked away just enough to pretend the words had not affected her. I am apparently the only one in this fortress who believes tea should not have motives. Kalethor's mouth curved. I'll remember that. He said it lightly, almost casually, but the way he looked at her when he said it made the moment linger. Too long. Long enough for Overia to realize the strange truth spreading through the castle. Kalethor was beginning to rely on her, not because she was convenient, but because he trusted her. And that trust was becoming the kind of thing that changed the shape of a room. She picked up the discarded tray, more to keep her hands busy than anything else, and muttered, Wonderful. I've now been promoted to official tea detective. Cyra laughed again. Kalethor's expression warmed, and somewhere deeper in the fortress, Aaron was already searching for a cleaner way to stain her name. But for the first time, Overia had the sense that he might be too late. By the time the fortress bells rang for the third time that morning, Overia had already fixed two problems nobody had bothered to notice. The first was in the kitchen corridor, where a cracked water pipe had started leaking into the linen storage. She caught it before the floor turned slick enough to send a servant sprawling. The second was in the herb room, where someone had left a tray of cooling tea directly under an open window, which was a wonderful way to ruin Cyra's infusion, and an even better way to make Overia deeply suspicious of everyone employed in this building. She was kneeling beside the tray with her sleeves rolled up when Kalethor appeared in the doorway. He had started doing that more often lately, not in a way that felt accidental, not in a way that felt ceremonial either, just present. He entered spaces with the kind of quiet authority that made everyone else subtly remember they had work to do. Overia looked up at him. If you are here to tell me the tea is haunted, I'm already behind schedule. His mouth twitched. Is it always like this with you? Constantly. The castle should bill me as an environmental condition. Kalethor's eyes drifted over the tray, then to the open window, then back to her. What happened? Overia lifted the cloth and sniffed the tea. Someone put this under the window and let the cold do the rest. If this reaches Cyra, she'll feel it in her stomach. That was enough to pull his attention fully sharp. Can it be fixed? Yes, if I can get fresh water, warmer cloths, and 5 minutes without people pretending they're too important to carry things. He studied her for a beat. Then, without asking anyone else, he took the tray from her hand. Overia blinked once. Are you helping me? Don't sound so shocked. I'm just adjusting to the concept. He gave her a look. You've spent too much time in this fortress if basic decency surprises you. Overia gave a short laugh and stood, brushing straw from her skirt. It's not basic decency. It's suspiciously competent assistance. I'm going to need a minute to process it. He carried the tray down the corridor himself, which was such an unkingly thing to do that Overia nearly smiled just from seeing it. The other servants noticed too. They lowered their heads, but not before the ripple of surprise moved through the hall. That mattered. Small things always mattered in a place like this. When they reached Cyra's chamber, the sacred wolf was resting near the hearth, one hand over her belly, her face calm but alert. She lifted her head immediately when she saw them. Why do I feel like the answer to this question is going to inconvenience me? She asked. Overia set the freshly prepared cup on the side table. Because your instincts are excellent. Kalethor looked at Cyra, then at Overia. The tea was left in the cold. Cyra's ears tipped back in mild annoyance. Of course it was. Overia folded her arms. I'm beginning to think this fortress believes weather counts as an ingredient. Cyra made a soft sound that was almost a laugh. Kalethor moved closer to the hearth and checked the room's temperature with a glance that told Overia he was noticing everything she noticed. Maybe more. That was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Who handled the delivery? He asked. Overia could hear the edge in his voice. Not anger. Worse. Concern. The kind that meant he had already started connecting lines in his head. Before she could answer, Mina appeared in the doorway, stiff-backed and offended by the concept of being summoned by someone else's conversation. Your Majesty, the replacement supplies are on the lower level. The staff was instructed to... Overia turned. The staff was instructed to what? Freeze the tea? Test whether the sacred wolf can digest disappointment? Mina's jaw tightened. There is no need to be rude. Overia gave her a flat look. There is every need. You've all been doing that thing where you call negligence procedure and expect it to sound respectful. Kalethor glanced at Mina. Who ordered the placement? Mina hesitated. Just long enough. Overia caught it. Kalethor caught it too. That was the problem with people like Erin and Mina. They believed hesitation was invisible if they stood still enough. It wasn't. It came through the logistics office, Mina said at last. Erin revised the route. Overia's shoulders went still. There he was again. The smiling problem with a clipboard and a conscience buried under polished manners. Kalethor's expression sharpened immediately. Without consulting the chamber attendants? Mina's voice remained clipped. He said it was an efficiency adjustment. Overia snorted. Efficiency adjustment is such a beautiful way to say, I made a decision that affects a pregnant sacred wolf without asking the person who feeds her. Cyra's eyes flicked to Overia, amused and a little tired. You do that better than anyone I know. Overia bowed her head in mock seriousness. I contain a number of valuable skills. Sarcasm is just the most visible one. Kalethor's mouth twitched again. Then he asked Mina very quietly, Did Aaron alter anything else? Mina looked away a fraction. That was answer enough. Overia felt the floor beneath the moment shift, not because of the tea, because of the pattern. This was not a random mistake. This was not carelessness. Aaron was moving pieces around the fortress, quietly, reassigning things, redirecting supplies, adjusting who saw what and when. It was the kind of cruelty that didn't leave bruises, only confusion. By the time someone noticed, the blame could already be sitting on the wrong person's lap. And if he kept doing it, eventually that wrong person would be Overia. Kalethor's voice hardened. "Bring me the route ledger." Mina blinked. "Your Majesty?" Now, Mina left with visible restraint, though Overia could practically feel her irritation vibrating in the doorway. Cyra exhaled through her nose. "He's doing that thing again." Overia turned. "What thing?" "The thing where he acts calm enough that everyone else starts panicking on his behalf." That pulled a quiet laugh from Overia. Kalethor looked at Cyra, then at Overia. "He's moving the delivery paths without telling the people affected." Overia nodded once. "Because if he tells the people affected, then they might notice what he's doing." Kalethor studied her. "You saw that instantly," she shrugged. "I grew up in a place where the people in charge smiled a lot before making things worse." That line landed harder than she expected. Kalethor's eyes lingered on her for a beat that felt more personal than the words should have been. Then Cyra shifted, one hand pressing lightly over her belly. Overia moved at once. "Pain?" "No, just movement." "Good. We prefer movement to pain. It's a much better review." Cyra smiled despite herself. Kalethor's attention was on Overia now, and it had been for some time. She knew that. She also knew he was trying to measure what she was carrying. Not just herbs and tea, but the burden of being the person who kept noticing things no one else wanted to see. That mattered to him. It showed, and that was the dangerous part. Because he was starting to look at her not like a staff member, not like a nuisance, and not even like a surprise. He was starting to look at her like a person whose judgment he trusted. Overia forced herself to focus on the tea. That was safer than focusing on him. The door opened again. This time, Aaron entered. He looked immaculate, as always, and deeply pleased with the kind of control that came from never having to raise his voice. He held a ledger under one arm and a folded sheet in the other. His smile reached everyone in the room except his eyes. "Your Majesty, I've brought the revised route schedule." Overia straightened. Kalethor took the papers but didn't open them yet. "You changed the chamber deliveries." "I streamlined them." Overia turned slowly. "You moved tea meant for the sacred wolf into a colder route and didn't tell anyone." Aaron gave her that same polite expression he always did, the one that somehow made every word feel like a reprimand. "I did what was necessary." Overia folded her arms. "You always say that like it means something good." Kalethor's eyes were on Aaron now. "Explain." Aaron did not look at her first this time. He looked at Kalethor, as if the king were the only room in the room. "The household has become too dependent on the Omega's informal presence in the royal wing. Some structure is required." There it was. Not an attack. A frame. Overia's presence had become the issue, not the problem-solving, not the tea, not the fact that she kept preventing actual mistakes. Kalethor's gaze sharpened. She prevented a mistake. Aaron smiled slightly. Or encouraged access where it should not have been assumed. Overia felt the temperature in the room drop. That was the cruelty she feared most from him, the kind that wrapped itself in vocabulary. He wanted the fortress to start associating her with impropriety, with overreach, with being too close to what she had no right to touch. And once that idea took root, people like him knew it could do all the work for them. Overia gave a short, dry laugh. "You do love making access sound like a scandal." Aaron turned his attention to her with exaggerated patience. "It becomes one when the wrong people grow comfortable." Kalethor's face tightened. Cyra watched the exchange in silence, her expression more thoughtful than frightened. She understood enough by now to know this was not about tea. Aaron was trying to isolate Overia by making her presence feel like a liability. Overia understood that too. And because she understood it, she refused to shrink. The wrong people? She repeated. You mean the people who keep your system from collapsing because they're too busy doing the work you name after yourself? A faint ripple moved through the nearby attendants. Aaron's smile barely shifted. Careful. That sounds personal. Overia met his gaze. It is personal. You've been moving things around the fortress like a man trying to prove he can rearrange the furniture while the house is still on fire. Kalethor looked from her to Aaron. Is there another reason for the route change? Aaron paused. Just a fraction. But it was enough. Overia noticed it and filed it away. Kalethor did too. He opened the ledger at last and read the changes. His expression darkened as he turned a page, then another. Overia couldn't see the details from where she stood, but she didn't need to. The shift in his face told her enough. Aaron had changed more than one thing. Too many things. Overia stepped closer. What is it? Kalethor looked up at her. 2 of Cyra's morning supplements were reassigned to lower storage. Overia blinked. Why would he do that? Aaron answered smoothly. Because the upper wing is overstocked. Overia stared at him. Then she laughed once in disbelief. That is the most nonsense I've ever heard in a room with windows. Kalethor's eyes stayed on Aaron. Tell me the real reason. Aaron did not move. The real reason is that the upper wing has become unstable. Too many people crossing paths. Too much attachment to one Omega. Overia felt the words hit before she fully processed them. Attachment. That was the knife. Not the tea. Not the roots. The implication. He was saying she had become too central, too present, too noticed, too close. Kalethor's jaw tightened. Overia went very still, because now she understood. Aaron wasn't only trying to turn the staff against her, he was trying to make her look dangerous to the king. Kalethor set the ledger down with careful precision. You are overstepping. Aaron's tone remained mild. I'm protecting the household from unnecessary complications. Overia looked at Kalethor, then back at Aaron. You mean from me? Aaron didn't deny it. That silence said more than the words would have. Kalethor stepped forward. She is not a complication. Aaron's eyes flicked once to the king. Then prove it. That landed harder than a shout because it was so controlled. Overia felt the room tighten. Kalethor stared at Aaron for one long moment, and Overia saw what he was seeing now. Not a loyal advisor, not merely an administrator, but a man who had decided that control mattered more than truth. Aaron wanted the fortress orderly enough to survive his own influence. Overia threatened that influence because she was useful without being owned. That was motivation. Deep, ugly, understandable motivation. And that made him more dangerous. Overia's chest rose with a slow breath. She knew that look in his type. The kind of person who believed any disturbance should be removed before it became a precedent. She also knew she was not going to let him remove her. Fine, she said suddenly. 3 heads turned toward her. Overia looked at Aaron. If you're so committed to proving I'm a problem, then let's make this simple. Show me the revised routes. Show me the upper storage shift. Show me exactly what you changed and who told you to do it. Aaron's expression sharpened. You don't have authority to demand that. Overia smiled. No, but I do have the attention of the king, which turns out to be more useful than a clipboard. That almost made Kalethor smile. Almost. Aaron realized then that the room was no longer entirely on his side. And that was the first real crack in his composure. Overia could feel it. He would not strike loudly. He would not lose his temper. But now he had a reason to work harder. He would find another way to make her look like the disruption. And if he couldn't do it through supplies, he'd do it through people. Kalethor closed the ledger. I want the revised routes reviewed with Overia present. Aaron's eyes tightened. Overia heard it before anyone said it aloud. He was losing control of the narrative. And that, more than anything, would make him dangerous. When he finally left, the room breathed again. Cyra looked at Overia with quiet understanding. He wanted to separate you from the hallway. Overia blinked at her. You make it sound like I'm a chair they keep moving out of the room. More like a lamp they don't want anyone to notice is on. Overia laughed despite herself. Kalethor was looking at her with a kind of attention that had become increasingly difficult to ignore. Not the attention of a king evaluating a servant. The attention of a man realizing he trusted a woman he did not want to lose. He spoke more quietly now. You were right. Overia looked at him. About which part? About him. That was enough to make something warm and painful and very alive shift in her chest. She looked away first because it was easier than standing in the full force of being seen. Cyra noticed, of course. She always noticed. If the two of you are going to start looking at each other like that, I want more tea first. Overia let out a laugh that was half relief, half embarrassment. Kalethor's mouth curved. And for a moment, just a moment, the fortress felt like a place where Overia might actually belong. Not because Aaron allowed it, because she had started making that room hold her. By the next morning, Overia had learned two things. First, the fortress had started treating her like a roomer with shoes. Second, Aaron was very much still committed to being unbearable. The change was subtle enough that anyone who wasn't living inside it might have missed it. No one had shouted at her. No one had openly accused her of anything. That would have been easier. Instead, people hesitated when she entered a room. Servants waited one beat too long before answering. Guards looked at her, then away, as if their eyes had been told to misbehave. It was the kind of cruelty that did not bruise the skin, only the air around it. Overia noticed because she noticed everything. She stood in the corridor outside Cyra's chamber, carrying a basket of fresh cloths and a small tray of herbs she had personally checked twice, and muttered under her breath, "Well, this is new. I'm being treated like a clerical error with legs." The maid beside her gave a nervous glance down the hall. Overia lifted a brow. "Don't worry. I don't bite unless administration deserves it." That earned the tiniest, traitorous smile. Before Overia could step into the chamber, Kalethor appeared at the far end of the hallway. He was moving fast, but not rushed. There was a difference. He had the controlled stride of a man who was used to being obeyed and had recently become familiar with making other people nervous without trying. His gaze found Overia immediately, then the basket, then her face, and something in his expression changed. Not visibly, not enough for anyone else to point to it. But Overia saw it. He saw the way she'd been boxed into a silence that wasn't hers. He saw the way the staff around her had started acting like she was temporary. That made her stomach tighten in a way she did not feel like examining. "What happened?" he asked. Overia looked at him, then past him to the two servants lingering near the wall, then back at him. "Apparently I've become less popular than a splinter." Kalethor's mouth twitched. "That sounds like an exaggeration." "It is. I'm being treated with almost as much warmth as a tax audit." A low breath of amusement moved through his nose. Then his face settled again, the humor giving way to attention. "Say it plainly." Overia's fingers tightened around the basket handle. "They're avoiding me." He held her gaze. "Because of Aaron." It wasn't a question. She gave a small shrug that was mostly for show. "That's the likely culprit. He has the sort of face that makes people believe a schedule is a weapon." Kalethor looked toward the corridor behind her, where two attendants had suddenly found the floor deeply interesting. "Has he spoken to you?" "Not directly. That would be rude." Kalethor gave her a flat look. "You know what I mean." Overia exhaled. "He doesn't need to. He's been moving things around, changing routes, leaving people to connect the wrong dots. That's the trick, isn't it? He doesn't have to attack me if he can make everyone else do it for him." Kalethor's expression darkened. This was the thing she was starting to understand about him. He did not just get angry when she was mistreated. He got precise. And precision, in a king, was often more dangerous than fury. "Come with me," he said. Overia blinked. "That sounds suspiciously like an order." "It is. I'm offended by how little warning you gave me." Still, she followed. He led her through a side hall and into one of the smaller workrooms adjoining the upper wing, a warm chamber lined with shelves, ledgers, and stacked linen bundles. It was quieter here. Fewer ears. Fewer reasons for people to perform the wrong version of themselves. Once the door shut behind them, Kalethor turned to face her. "Aaron has been redirecting supplies." Overia crossed her arms. "I noticed. He's also been telling people that your access to the Sacred Wolf's chambers creates unnecessary instability." Overia stared at him for a second, then let out a very tired laugh. "That man looks at a spilled cup and sees a thesis." Kalethor did not smile this time. "He wants you isolated." The words landed because they were true. Overia looked away and then back again, trying to decide how much honesty she wanted to hand him, while he stood there looking at her like he was already taking her seriously. "That's not new for me." Kalethor's face changed, not dramatically, not enough for easy reading. But Overia felt it anyway. The quiet shift of someone realizing that a wound they didn't cause was still one they had the power to touch. "It should be," he said. It was a small line. Simple. It should not have done anything to her. It did. Overia looked at the shelves so she wouldn't have to look at him looking at her. "You're getting dangerously good at saying things like that. I could say the same to you." She glanced back. "I prefer to think of myself as charmingly survivable." "That's not what I meant." Of course not. That was the trouble. He almost never meant only one thing anymore. Kalethor stepped to the desk and laid a stack of papers down. Delivery routes, chamber schedules, staff assignments. Overia caught the shift in them immediately, even before she read the details. He moved the linen deliveries again. Kalethor nodded once. And the tea stores. Overia exhaled slowly. He's trying to make the whole wing dependent on people who answer to him, and make you look like the person who can't keep up with the changes. She looked at the papers, then at him. Then she laughed, but there was no humor in it this time. "He really is committed. I respect the stamina, if not the personality." Kalethor's eyes remained on her. "Do you know why he's doing it?" Overia paused. There was the obvious answer: power, control, order. But that wasn't all of it. Men like Aaron never acted without a private logic, however ugly. She studied the papers for a beat, then said slowly, "Because I'm not part of the system he can own." Kalethor said nothing. Overia kept going, because once she started seeing it, she couldn't unsee it. "I'm not from the right family. I don't have the right patron. I'm not impressed by the right people. And I keep ending up where I'm not supposed to be, helping the person he thought he could keep surrounded by rules and quiet yes-men." Kalethor watched her closely. Overia gave a small, dry smile. "In other words, I'm inconvenient." "No." He said it so immediately that she looked up. Kalethor's expression had gone very still. "You're not inconvenient. You're a problem for him because you're effective." That hit harder than any compliment should have. Overia felt something warm and unfamiliar tighten low in her chest. She cleared her throat. "That's the nicest way anyone's ever called me annoying." His mouth twitched. "I'm adapting to your language." Overia barked out a laugh before she could stop herself. For one brief second, the room eased. Then the door opened without warning. Aaron entered. He stopped the instant he saw them alone together. Overia saw it in his eyes first. Calculation. Not surprise. Calculation. He was already rearranging what he thought the room meant. "Your Majesty," he said smoothly. "I didn't realize this was a private meeting." Overia folded her arms. That's because you're not the kind of person who assumes other people talk to each other without your permission. Aaron's polite expression did not move. I came to update the revised routing approvals. Kalethor did not look at the papers. The revisions stop. Aaron blinked once. Your Majesty? You're overreaching. The words were quiet, final. Overia looked from one to the other. Aaron, for the first time since she'd met him, seemed fractionally off balance. It was small, but it was there. He recovered almost immediately, of course. Men like him always did. I only want to protect the household from confusion. Overia let out a short laugh. You say that like confusion isn't your actual hobby. Aaron's attention slid to her, cool and thin as paper. Your continued presence in the royal wing is drawing comment. Overia didn't move. From whom? Aaron smiled just enough to be insulting. Staff, advisors, people with better judgment. Overia's eyes narrowed. Then perhaps they should try using some. The room went quiet. Kalethor's hand moved very slightly to the edge of the desk. Not a threat, a restraint. He was controlling something larger than anger. Aaron looked at him. The route changes are necessary. Not if they're being used to isolate her. Aaron's expression tightened. That was the important thing. Not the fact that he'd been challenged. The fact that Kalethor had named what he was doing. Not confusion. Not routine. Isolation. Overia felt the shift with a kind of exhausted clarity. This was the point. Aaron wasn't just moving boxes and papers. He was shaping the way the fortress perceived her. If he could make her seem unsupported, disposable, and out of place, then eventually people would stop asking whether she belonged there. They would just assume she didn't. That was cruelty without bruises, and it was clever enough to be dangerous. Aaron clasped his hands behind his back. I'm ensuring that personal attachments do not interfere with stability. Overia turned her head slowly. Oh, there it was. The real blade. He wasn't only talking about her work. He was talking about Kalethor's attention, about the fact that the king was now looking at her too often, listening to her too closely, trusting her in ways that could not be filed under routine. Overia's mouth went dry for half a second, not from fear, but from the sharpness of being understood by the wrong person. She recovered fast. Personal attachments? That's a funny phrase from a man who thinks furniture placement is an emotional state. Aaron ignored the jab. You understand what I mean. Yes, she said. You mean the part where I'm becoming harder to ignore? That landed. He didn't show much reaction, but she saw the slight tightening around his eyes. Kalethor looked at her then, and the way he did it was quiet enough to be private even in a room with witnesses. It was not a king assessing a useful servant. It was a man realizing the cost of having someone this bright under his protection. Overia hated how much she liked that feeling. She hated more that she trusted it. Aaron produced a document from the stack in his hand and laid it on the desk. Then perhaps you'll want to review this. Kalethor picked it up. His face changed as he read. Overia stepped closer. The page listed chamber access notes, delivery timing, and witness signatures. Then she saw it. Her name, attached to a missing authorization line. Her stomach turned cold. That's not mine, she said immediately. Aaron's tone remained gentle. No one said it was. Kalethor looked up sharply. Overia felt the room narrow around the paper in his hand. Aaron had done it carefully. Not a direct accusation. Better than that. A missing approval. A gap in the record. Enough to make it look as though she had overstepped, entered where she shouldn't, interfered with a royal routine without clearance. Not violence. Worse. Paperwork as a weapon. Kalethor's voice turned low. Explain this. Aaron's expression was almost sympathetic. There was concern that the Omega had been granted informal access too often. I thought it best to document the discrepancy before it became a larger issue. Overia stared at him. He had created the discrepancy and then positioned himself as the man clean enough to notice it. That was so infuriating she almost laughed. Instead, she said very softly, "You are unbelievable." Aaron tilted his head. "I'm thorough." "No, you're cowardly with stationery." Kalethor, despite himself, made the smallest sound that might have been laughter if he'd had any interest in allowing it to exist. Aaron heard it. Overia saw the flicker of irritation on his face and knew exactly how much that small reaction mattered. He had not expected Kalethor to be amused by her in front of him. More importantly, he had not expected Kalethor to stay on her side while being given a document that could have been used to isolate her. That was the kind of thing that changed a room permanently. Kalethor set the paper down. "Remove the notation." Aaron did not move. "Your Majesty, if we ignore..." "Remove it." The command was quiet enough to make the air hard. Aaron's jaw tightened. Overia watched him carefully. He was angry, yes, but not at being wrong, at losing control of the story. That was the true wound. He had tried to make her look like a disruption, and instead, he'd shown the king exactly how he was doing it. Kalethor looked at Overia. "Did you enter the corridor without clearance?" Overia blinked. Then she smiled, because she understood why he was asking. He was giving her a chance to answer in the room, in front of Aaron, without making her defend herself like a criminal. She met his eyes. "I entered the corridor because your household was about to serve a pregnant sacred wolf tea, mixed by someone who doesn't know the difference between calm and incapacitated." A beat. Then, more quietly, "So, no, I didn't do what he's implying." Kalethor nodded once. That was it. That single nod carried more defense than a speech would have. Aaron's composure held, but Overia could feel the pressure underneath it. He was not losing his temper. He was losing the frame. That made him more dangerous, not less. He looked at Kalethor. "You are allowing emotion to influence governance." Kalethor's answer was immediate. "You are mistaking control for governance." Silence. Overia looked between them and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the room temperature. That was the shape of Aaron's motivation, finally visible. He wanted a fortress that ran on hierarchy, procedure, predictability. Overia was the opposite of that. She was unsanctioned usefulness, unowned competence, a person whose presence proved that power could exist outside his hands, and that threatened him. Not because she was weak, because she wasn't. Aaron drew a slow breath. "If you continue to permit this level of interference, the staff will begin to question the standard of order in the royal wing." Overia crossed her arms. "The staff is already questioning it. They're just doing it quietly because they'd rather protect their jobs than your ego." That was too much, even by his standards. Aaron looked at her then with something colder than irritation. Not hate, interest. The ugly kind. The kind that meant he had started marking her as a problem to be solved later. Overia had seen that look before. It never meant anything good. Kalethor stepped a fraction in front of her without fully blocking her, and she noticed. Of course she noticed. He had not made a grand gesture. He had simply moved his body in a way that said the room would have to go through him first. It should not have made her chest tighten. It did. Aaron noticed that too. Of course he did. He bowed, and this time the gesture had edges. "I'll revise the notation." Then he left. Only after the door shut did Overia realize she'd been holding her breath. She let it out slowly. Kalethor looked at the document, then at her. "You were right." She glanced up. "About which part?" "About him being dangerous." Overia gave a faint, humorless smile. "I'd be more offended if he weren't." The king held her gaze a moment longer than necessary. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't obvious. But the room had already changed. She could feel it. The way he looked at her now carried something heavier than trust and quieter than affection. It was the kind of attention that made her want to look away and step closer at the same time. Cyra appeared at the doorway a second later, her expression tired but alert. Did I miss the part where I'm supposed to drink tea and pretend I wasn't just used as a prop in a bureaucratic coup? Overia turned, and the laugh that left her this time was real. Kalethor actually smiled. And for one brief, impossible moment, the fortress felt like it had lost its grip on the shape of the story. Because Overia was no longer just being watched, she was being seen. By the time the sun reached the western windows, the fortress no longer felt merely tense. It felt divided. Overia noticed it in the way people looked at her and then looked away, in the way servants paused before answering her questions, in the way one guard at the inner corridor had stepped aside too quickly, as if standing too near her might get him blamed for something. It was not open hostility. It was worse. It was hesitation. And hesitation, Overia had learned, was how cruelty introduced itself when it intended to stay a while. She stood in the herb room with a basket of dried leaves in her arms and stared at the latest supply sheet, then at the box beside her, then back at the sheet. I am genuinely impressed, she muttered. He has turned the entire wing into a lesson in passive-aggressive architecture. Cyra, resting near the hearth in a woven chair that had been brought in specially for her, lifted her head. You've been muttering for 10 minutes. I'm trying to decide whether this is sabotage or just incompetence with a nice haircut. Cyra's mouth curved faintly. Kalethor was not in the room yet, but Overia could feel the weight of his absence in a way that made her annoyed with herself. That was not a feeling she had requested, and certainly not one she had the time to be managing. The door opened a moment later. He entered carrying 2 stacked ledgers and the kind of expression that said he had spent the last hour deciding whether to be kingly about a problem or personally annoyed by it. Overia looked up. If that face is for me, I'd like to file a complaint with the universe. Kalethor's eyes shifted to her immediately. Are you all right? It was such a simple question that it startled her. She blinked. That depends. Is this the part where you mean, are you in immediate danger? Or the part where you mean, have the walls become emotionally hostile? His mouth twitched. Both. That, unfortunately, made her smile. Only a little. But enough. He noticed. Of course he noticed. Kalethor set the ledgers on the table and surveyed the room. The new chair for Cyra, the stacked herbs, the adjusted tea tray, the revised routes pinned to the wall. He took in everything in a single glance, then looked back at Overia. Aaron submitted a complaint. Overia didn't move. Of course he did. He says you've taken to overreaching beyond your station. Cyra let out a tired sound from the chair. He says that as if station is a natural law instead of a hobby. Overia glanced at her, surprised and pleased. Thank you. That is the most elegant insult I've heard all week. Kalethor's eyes flicked between them, and something in his expression softened before settling again. He also claims you've been influencing chamber access and supply movement without authorization. Overia set the basket down very carefully. That sounds suspiciously like she noticed what I was doing and ruined it. Kalethor said nothing. That silence was answer enough. Overia drew in a slow breath. This was the real attack now. Not the tea, not the linen, not the route changes. The accusation. The attempt to make her look as though she had inserted herself where she didn't belong. She looked at the wall, then back at Kalethor. He's trying to make me sound ambitious in the wrong way. Kalethor's gaze stayed on hers. He wants to make your competence look like intent. That hit because it was true, and because it was a way of naming her danger to the system without calling her dangerous at all. Overia laughed once, quietly, without humor. I knew he was unpleasant. I didn't know he was poetic about it. Kalethor moved closer to the table and opened the top ledger. I've reviewed the route logs myself. Overia's head lifted. That got her attention. He continued, voice low and measured. Aaron altered the tea rotation again. He also reassigned one of Cyra's morning supplements to storage without a reason that would stand up to questioning. Cyra's eyes sharpened. Again? Kalethor nodded once. Overia folded her arms. He's doing it to build a record, not just to annoy us. Kalethor looked at her. Explain. She stared at the ledgers for a second and then saw the shape of it too clearly to ignore. He's creating a paper trail. If he can make it look like I'm constantly involved in things I shouldn't be touching, then eventually he can say I'm reckless, intrusive, and unable to be trusted with the sacred wolf's care. Kalethor was quiet. Overia continued, the pieces falling into place in her mind as she spoke. And if he does that enough times, people won't remember whether I actually caused anything. They'll just remember that my name was always near a problem. Cyra's ears angled slightly back, not in fear, but in understanding. Kalethor's expression hardened. That is what he's doing. Overia gave a small nod. Yes, he's turning me into a pattern. That was the cruelty of it. Not the blow. The accumulation. The way someone could be worn down by repetition until they began to sound guilty simply for existing in the wrong room too often. Kalethor shut the ledger with a quiet thud. No more private corrections. Overia blinked. What? If he wants to build a record, he'll do it in the open. From now on, every route change, every supply shift, every access adjustment goes through me. That should have made her feel safer. It did. It also made something else rise in her chest that she did not fully trust yet. Because he was not only defending her, he was choosing to stand beside her in the conflict. That was very different. Overia looked at him for a long second. You know that makes you part of the problem, right? Kalethor's mouth quirked. I'm willing to risk it. That was too much honesty in too few words. She looked away first, because the alternative was letting him see exactly how much that meant. Cyra, who had been watching the two of them with a quiet, knowing expression, suddenly inhaled. Overia was at her side in an instant. Cyra? The sacred wolf had gone still, one hand pressed to her belly, her breath sharper than before. Something's wrong, she murmured. Kalethor was there immediately, too, his face changing in the way it always did when instinct overrode control. Overia watched the two of them and felt the old pull again, that strange thread of sensation that had never fully gone away since the barn. Only now it sharpened into something more urgent. Not fear. Need. The need to act. Cyra closed her eyes for a second. Not pain. I felt a pull. Overia frowned. Like before? Cyra nodded once. Kalethor's jaw tightened. Toward what? The wolf opened her eyes slowly, and the expression on her face was no longer tired. It was focused. The lower corridor. Overia went still. Kalethor's head lifted, and at exactly the same time, a sharp sound rang from somewhere beyond the room. Not a scream. Not quite. A crash. Then shouting. Overia was already moving before the second sound reached them. Kalethor followed immediately. They pushed out into the hall together, Cyra behind them with one hand braced at her side and two attendants rushing after her. The lower corridor, which had been quiet an instant before, was suddenly alive with noise. A dropped tray, a broken bottle, hurried footsteps, and voices rising too fast to be casual. Overia reached the bend first and saw the mess. A crate of chamber teas had split open across the floor. One of the storage shelves had partially collapsed. Two servants were staring at one another in shock while a guard tried to restore order with useless barking. And standing at the far end of the hall, perfectly composed amid the chaos, was Aaron. Overia felt something cold spread through her chest. Of course. Of course he was here. He turned when he noticed them and spread one hand slightly, as if he were the only calm person in the building. Your Majesty, I was just about to send word. Overia looked at the spilled teas, the broken bottle, the ruined shelf. Then she looked at Aaron. Did you arrange this? Aaron's expression was that same smooth mask. The shelf was unstable. You say that with such confidence for someone standing in the exact center of the problem. Kalethor's eyes moved across the corridor, taking in the scene in one sweep. His face stayed controlled, but Overia could feel the tension in him. Aaron bowed his head slightly. The lower storage needs reviewing. Overia knelt immediately beside the broken crate. The scent hit her first. Not just tea, something else. Her fingers hovered over the spilled contents, then touched one of the shattered vials. Her expression changed. Kalethor noticed. What is it? Overia did not answer right away. She picked up the label, read it, and went very still. Then she looked up. This crate was supposed to contain restorative tea. Aaron's face did not move. It does. No, it doesn't. She held up the shattered vial. This is sleep draft. The corridor went silent. Cyra, now reaching the bend with the attendants behind her, stopped cold. Kalethor's eyes snapped to Aaron. Explain. Aaron opened his hands slightly. The supplies are mislabeled. Overia gave a slow laugh that held no amusement whatsoever. That is such a fascinating phrase to use after you've been caught with a crate full of sedatives. Aaron's eyes were on her now, calm, measured, but she saw it. Not anger, something worse. The recognition that the room had turned before he expected. Kalethor stepped closer to the crate and looked at the label himself. His jaw tightened. These were moved from upper storage. Aaron's answer came a fraction too fast. An error in transit. Overia stood. No, this is staged. The words landed like a stone in water. One of the attendants gasped softly. Aaron's gaze sharpened, though his voice stayed level. That is a serious accusation. So is using sleep draft near the wing where the sacred wolf rests. Cyra took a slow breath, her hand still on her belly. Why was this here? She asked quietly. Aaron turned toward her with the expression of a man ready to sound reasonable no matter how rotten the facts became. To sort the supplies before they reached your chambers. Overia stared at him, then at the crate, then back at him, and suddenly the shape of it made sense. He had engineered a failure. Not a loud one, a small, deniable one. If the wrong tea had reached Cyra's room, and if Overia had been anywhere near the route, he could have claimed the mix-up was her fault, or at least her responsibility. A sedative in the wrong place. An exhausted sacred wolf. A staff member already under suspicion. It was elegant. It was cruel. It was exactly the kind of damage he would prefer, one that could be explained away until it was too late. Overia felt anger rise hot in her throat. Not fear. Not yet. Anger. You were going to let her drink this. Aaron's expression remained composed. You are drawing conclusions. I am reading the label you forgot to destroy. A faint twitch moved near his jaw. That was enough. Kalethor's voice dropped into something very quiet. Why was sleep draft moved into restorative storage? Aaron looked at him, then with all the polish in the world said, Because someone in the household is moving supplies without reporting changes. I only discovered the error after the fact. Overia let out a sharp laugh. Oh, that's adorable. You set a trap and then acted surprised when someone fell into it. The attendants looked stunned now. One of the guards had stopped pretending to be invisible. Aaron kept his voice smooth. If there is a trap, perhaps you should consider why you were the one standing near it. Overia turned to him fully. This was it. This was his method. He had not yet physically harmed anyone. But he had created the conditions for harm, then positioned her near the blame. The cruelty was in the structure, not the impact. He wanted the fortress to believe she was the reason the room kept going wrong. And if he could not destroy her with facts, he would do it with implication. Kalethor stepped between her and Aaron just enough to make the message clear. "You will explain this to me in my chambers." Aaron's face remained still. "Of course, Your Majesty." But Overia saw the calculation beneath it. He had misjudged the room. That made him dangerous, yes, but it also made him impatient. And impatient men made mistakes. Cyra looked at the spilled vials, then at Overia, then at Kalethor. Her voice was calm, but it carried. Whoever did this wanted confusion, not an accident. The silence that followed was absolute. Overia looked at the sacred wolf and felt the strange power of her words. Cyra was not merely reacting. She was naming the shape of the harm. That mattered. Kalethor turned to her immediately. "Are you certain?" Cyra gave one measured nod. "The pull I felt led here. Not because of the spill, because something was wrong before it happened." Overia stared. Then she understood the deeper thread. The pull, the warning. Whatever ancient bond existed in the royal bloodline, Cyra had sensed the danger before anyone else. And if that was true, then Aaron had nearly succeeded in setting a piece in motion that could have made Overia look reckless, careless, and dangerous all at once. Aaron's expression stayed pleasant. Too pleasant. "I'm sure everyone is tired. We should clear the corridor." Overia let out a breath. Then she looked at Kalethor, and what she saw there nearly undid her. Not anger, not just that. Resolve. He had seen enough. He believed her. Not partly, not conditionally. Fully. That should have felt like relief. It did. It also felt like the opening of something she had no name for yet. Kalethor turned to the guard. "Secure these crates. No one touches another supply without my presence or Overia's." Aaron's eyes sharpened instantly. Overia noticed. Of course she noticed. Kalethor had just done something small that was actually enormous. He had named her as a necessary witness, a decision-maker, someone whose presence mattered in the royal wing. Not just someone being protected, someone trusted. The guard bowed and moved quickly. Aaron's composure held, but only barely. Kalethor looked at him then, really looked. "We are finished here." Aaron inclined his head. "As you wish, Your Majesty." He left with the same smoothness he'd arrived with, but Overia knew the truth now. He had intended the fortress to see her as the problem. Instead, he had forced the king to see her as the person who kept finding the truth first. When the corridor began to empty, Overia exhaled slowly. Her hands were still trembling, but not from fear. Kalethor turned to her. His voice was low. "You were right." Overia gave him a tired, crooked look. "I know. It's exhausting, isn't it?" That pulled the smallest smile from him. Cyra, still standing near the bend, actually laughed once, softly. Overia looked at the shattered crate one more time. This was not over. Not even close. But the fortress had just seen what Aaron was willing to do, and Kalethor had just publicly chosen to stand where Overia stood. That was not resolution. Not yet. But it was the beginning of something the next chapter would not be able to pretend away. The fortress did not sleep that night. It waited. Overia felt it in the corridors long before dawn, in the stiff silence of servants who had finally understood that Aaron's neat little world was cracking. No one spoke loudly. No one ran unless they had to. Even the walls seemed to hold their breath. She stood in the upper workroom with Kalethor, Cyra, and the ledger spread open between them. Every altered route, every shifted tray, every false notation had been laid out. The proof was ugly in its simplicity. Aaron had been building a record to isolate her, then using that isolation to cover a far more serious plan. Weakening access around Cyra long enough to create a crisis, then placing blame where it would stick. Overia traced one line with her finger. He wanted me to look careless enough that no one would question the next mistake. Aaron, standing across from them with his perfect posture and dead smile, answered without heat. I wanted order. Cyra gave him a long, flat look. No, you wanted control. That landed harder than any shout. Aaron's expression tightened, just a fraction, and Overia saw the truth of him at last. Not a monster in the dramatic sense, but a man terrified of anyone he could not place beneath his thumb. Kalethor stepped forward. You altered supplies, misled staff, and tried to turn the household against her. Aaron lifted his chin. She had no standing. Overia laughed once, softly and without humor. That's your whole defense? I wasn't born useful to you, so you tried to make me disappear? The room went still. Kalethor's voice came out low and sharp. Her standing is here, with me. That was the first crack in Aaron's composure big enough for everyone to see. Not because the sentence was dramatic, but because it was final. Overia looked at Kalethor then, and the warmth in her chest was almost painful. He was not speaking as a king tidying a problem. He was speaking as a man making a choice in front of witnesses. Aaron tried one last time. You would elevate a lone Omega over an established advisor? Kalethor did not even blink. I would elevate truth over rot. Cyra exhaled slowly, as if the room itself had finally said something sensible. Then the king turned to the guards at the door. Take him. Aaron's eyes flashed once. Not fear, calculation. Even now, he was trying to find a way to survive the fall by turning it into procedure. But there was nowhere left to hide it. The guards moved. Aaron was restrained before he could perform another polished lie. He looked at Overia as they dragged him past. You think this changes anything? Overia met his gaze without flinching. It changes enough. That was all she gave him. No speech, no triumph, no cruelty, just the end of his leverage. When the door shut, the silence that followed was strange, almost holy. Not peace yet, but the first honest quiet the fortress had held in a long time. Cyra was the first to break it. He was getting bolder. Overia nodded. Because no one stopped him early enough. That did not sound like accusation. It sounded like truth. The kind that makes a place uncomfortable because it cannot be blamed on one person alone. Kalethor looked at her. He won't be allowed near the wing again. Overia folded her arms, suddenly aware of how tired she was. That's good. I was beginning to resent his face. That drew a small, tired smile from Cyra. Kalethor did not smile. He was watching Overia with a steadiness that had become its own kind of shelter. There's more. Overia frowned. He reached into the ledger and pulled out a second page. Letters, older than the recent changes. A pattern of correspondence between Aaron and a distant administrative house. Not treason, not war, but a slow attempt to consolidate influence over the fortress through supply control, staff placement, and social pressure. He had not only been targeting her, he had been building a private kingdom out of other people's obedience. Overia stared at the page. He's been doing this for years. Yes, Kalethor said. And no one noticed? Someone noticed, but no one had enough to prove it. Overia let out a long breath, then looked up at him. You did. Kalethor's expression softened. You did first. That made her chest tighten again. She wanted to deny it, to joke, to deflect. Instead, she looked at the table and said nothing for a moment, because some truths deserved a second to land. Cyra shifted, one hand over her belly. Overia was at her side instantly. Pain? The wolf shook her head. Just movement, stronger now. Kalethor stepped closer too, and for a moment the three of them stood in a strange triangle of exhaustion, relief, and unfinished tenderness. Overia had the sudden understanding that this was what the bond had been guiding them toward all along. Not a mystery for its own sake, but a place where they could finally stop surviving alone. She looked at Cyra. Then the baby is probably offended by the whole situation. Cyra gave a soft laugh. That sounds plausible. Kalethor's mouth curved. Overia glanced at him, and the look he gave her back made the room feel smaller in the best possible way. Not secretive, not forbidden, simply honest. He spoke first. You saved this household more than once. Overia snorted lightly. You're making me sound noble, which is rude. I prefer competent and difficult. You are both. That should not have been so affecting. It was, because he said it like it was obvious. Overia looked away before her face betrayed her. She was not ready to stand in the full force of being wanted near, respected openly, and chosen in front of everyone that mattered. But she also knew this. The lie had ended. Aaron had been exposed. Cyra was safe. The fortress could no longer pretend not to see her. Kalethor reached for the last sheet in the ledger and closed it. From this day forward, your work is official. Overia looked back at him. That sounds dangerously like a promotion. It is. Do I get better tea? You get proper quarters. That startled a laugh out of her. Now I know this is serious. You've gone straight to logistics. His expression warmed. Also, no more barns. Overia tilted her head. That was my favorite part of the experience. I don't believe you. Good. You're learning. Cyra laughed openly now, and the sound felt like the first clean note after too many false ones. By midday, the fortress had begun to rearrange itself around the truth. Mina was removed from direct chamber oversight pending review. The root ledgers were publicly corrected. The staff who had hesitated around Overia did not suddenly become kind, but they became honest, which was more useful. And Aaron, stripped of his authority, was gone from the wing. No one mentioned exile, but everyone knew it had happened. No one thanked Overia properly either, which was very on brand for the castle, but the way people now met her eyes was enough. That evening, Kalethor found her on the outer terrace. The wind was cold, but not punishing. Below them, the fortress glowed with soft lantern light, no longer feeling like a machine against her, but a place she had finally helped alter. He came to stand beside her without speaking for a while. At last, he said quietly, "Are you leaving?" Overia turned to him. The question had weight, but not pressure. He was asking, not claiming. She looked back over the terrace wall. Then she smiled, small and real. "Not if you want me to stay." Kalethor's answer was immediate. "I do." That was all. No grand declaration, no unnecessary promises, just a truth with enough gravity to change the air between them. Overia laughed under her breath, then shook her head. "You know, for a man who used to scare everyone in a room, you've become extremely readable." "That may be your fault." She looked at him, and this time she did not look away first. He lifted a hand, slow enough for her to stop him if she wanted, and brushed a stray strand of hair back from her face. The touch was careful. Certain, not claiming, simply offering closeness. Overia felt her breath catch. They did not kiss. That was right. This was not the sort of story that needed everything spoken or sealed in one moment. Some things were stronger because they were allowed to arrive. Instead, she rested her hand lightly against his wrist. And that was enough. Epilogue. Weeks later, the fortress had no more rumors about the Omega in the barn. It had only Overia, now with proper quarters, official duties, and a king who came to find her when he wanted honesty. Cyra delivered a healthy child with 2 sharp eyes and lungs strong enough to intimidate 3 attendants at once. Overia was the first non-royal person the baby reached for. She laughed when that happened, then looked at Kalethor and said very softly, "Well, That's my life now." He smiled,